So we'll go ahead and get started with some introductions. My name is Lucely Ortiz. I am an associate partner here at Promise54. And we like to lead and introduce ourselves with what we call radical humanity, in that we like to speak from, what brings us to this work at a personal level, not just professionally. And for me personally, a lot of what drives my passion for DEI work and education in particular are my parents. I'm the daughter of immigrants from Latin America, and that has informed a lot about my experiences in education in this country and overall navigating my identity as a first-generation college student growing up. Daughter of immigrant parents. My mom is a housekeeper. My dad is a gardener, and really understanding, what that has meant for my family in terms of access, in terms of what it's meant to navigate systems, and also what it's meant for me from a personal standpoint, navigating my identity in larger society and throughout my educational career. And I'm excited to turn it over to my colleague Kimberly to introduce herself.
Hi, good people. My name is Kimberly Osagie, and I often say that the doctor in front of my name is for me, more so for me than it is for others, in part because I, as a Black woman, am hoping to reclaim my power in a world that often asks that I feel and be small. And so call me Kimberly. That's the long way of saying call me Kimberly. I'm a partner here at Promise54, and a piece of my story was already in my introduction about the doctor in front of my name, but I'm a Nigerian woman who grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I always say that I experienced culture shock walking into and out of my front door all the time. I was very, very African in my household, and I was asked to be something else when I was out in the world, and I was often reconciling that, particularly in school. And so it has been my career's mission to figure out the ways in which we can support kiddos to be their full selves in school. And I don't think that we can do that without having us as the adults that are working in schools and supporting schools to model the kind of integrated, authentic ethos that we are hoping for kids to espouse in the next generation. So that's a little bit about what brings me to this work, and happy to be here and be able to hear from our illustrious colleagues over at TNTP about what brings each of you to the work. So Tamika, are you up next?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Tamika Chester, and I'm the partner for organizational learning and development at TNTP. I'll say what brings me to this work. I'm entering into my 20th year in education, and I've had the privilege of not only working at all levels of education and serving in a variety of roles. I started my career in education as a classroom aide. And so when you think about going from a classroom aide, a teacher, I was a principal, I worked at, state education, prison education. I've really gotten to see a wide range of experiences and ways that students experience our education system. And for me, I've always approached this work from the desire and the goal to make sure that every child who enters in any education space feels valued, feels loved, feels respected, because that was the experience I had in school. And when I got into this field, it was really shocking to me to know that not every student had that opportunity. And so my life's work has been, in whatever spaces I'm in, to make sure I am being a disruptor, being a collaborator, being a visionary, and being a help to make sure that kids have that feeling. And that is why I approach this work. And TNTP has been one of the highlights of my career in being in an organization of like-minded people, mission-driven people who really have the opportunity to focus on all phases of education at every level.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leticia de la Vara. I serve as Chief of Staff at TNTP with my colleague Tamika, and work with our CEO and executive body, basically as an advisor for pretty much all content, both internal and external, related to the organization. I joined TNTP actually just 4 years ago. This week is my 4-year anniversary at TNTP. And prior to that, worked not only in education, but across all sectors in the nonprofit, for-profit, and state agencies in a variety of sectors: housing, healthcare, immigration, criminal justice reform, voter engagement, civic engagement, and education. And what draws me to the education sector, no matter what, is it's really knowing that how students perceive themselves and the people who are around them in that classroom is not just a 9 to 3 thing. It is not just what happens at the desk. It's what shapes their view of the world going forward. So how they see leadership, how they see themselves, how they see their peers, how they see what success should look like versus what they know, and whether or not those things are aligned or in conflict, like that shapes who our world is 10, 15, 20 years and 10, 15, 20 generations from now. So really being able to be at the nucleus of what it means for change means being where the kids are, being where students are, and is what drives me to be at TNTP, focusing on not just what we serve externally to the students and districts that we serve, but also internally how we approach. And it's what keeps me at TNTP too. So really excited to join you all today.
Thank you both so much for sharing, for your wonderful introductions. But this idea of wanting to create spaces where students and where we as adults can bring our full selves and not feel like we're needing to navigate multiple identities or multiple sets of standards is really at the core of the work that we do at Promise54. We want to create environments where adults can thrive and bring all of their brilliance, all of their experiences in order to better serve the students and families and communities that we are working with. And we do that in a couple of different ways, through whether it's partnering with organizations and providing talent advising. We have learning communities, cohort experiences where organizations can come together in partnership with other organizations in advancing their journeys. We provide executive search, placing high-level leaders in organizations across the country, and also provide one-on-one coaching for leaders in organization as they embark on their personal journeys. And we also engage in research and hope to disseminate insights to the field as we develop and grow our own body of research, one of which is the case studies.
Yeah, about 3 years ago now, we released this study, the Unrealized Impact Study, which was full of lots and lots of quantitative data about making the case for diversity, inclusion, and equity in education. And so at that time, today, we've had something like 20,000 or more individual respondents to our survey data. Over 400 organizations have weighed in, and that's one way to tell a story that looks like a scatter plot on a screen. Lots and lots of data that says that we probably should be thinking more critically about how we are not only diversifying our organizations, but making the cultures in those organizations more inclusive. And we found ways to quantify and place organizations in quartiles or align them with organizational profiles around those quantitative data. But the question that kept coming up for us as we were out in the field pounding the pavement, telling the story by the numbers, was, but wait, what do organizations' real DEI journeys look like? I get the numbers and I understand that we need to be doing more, but what does it really look like on the ground to start a DEI journey, to weather the storm through a DEI journey? And do you ever arrive somewhere, or is it constantly iterative? And we found that that was the question that kept coming back to us over and over again. And so we thought the only appropriate way is that, one, we can tell a quantitative story, and there's great merit in that given the volume of data that we now have. And we found that the real secret sauce, the real journeys are captured in the qualitative stories that we could tell. And so that is what really birthed the case studies, is that we wanted to go deep as opposed to just wide. And either way, whether you're walking into your organizational meeting with a quantitative set of data or a qualitative set of stories, we hope that we're equipping folks with the tools to be able to walk into their team meetings, organizational meetings, one-on-ones with managers and say, the experience that we are building at our organization, it could stand to grow. And here's some data and evidence that lets us know that we could be doing better. So with that, we're excited to focus on the qualitative today. And our focus in these qualitative stories was that we wanted to do this a little bit differently than how it's been done before. So when you hear case study, oftentimes you think, gosh, it's got to be linear. And we found that our approach to case studies, we wanted to be radically human, which means that we assume that humans are imperfect, and we want to emphasize that in the very human work of organizational culture and inclusion. And we wanted to emphasize the thorny, multidimensional challenges that organizations face as they're trying to do this work. And so we're really, really grateful, given all of the messiness that comes with telling the real story. We're really grateful to the 3 organizations, Blue Engine, TNTP, who is here with us today, and College Track, who said, yep, you get to, please do feel free to tell our messy story. And while we're at it, we know that we might not always be there when someone picks up our story and starts to critique and pull it apart. And the organizational partners that we got to work with, that they were really, really open with us and with the world to tell their stories in this deeply human, radically human way. With that in mind, it's time for TNTP and to focus there. So our colleagues would love for you all to introduce TNTP as an organization.
Hi, so TNTP has been in the ed space since 1997. Sometimes it feels like 1927. But we are a national nonprofit that was founded by teachers. And really, the crux of our work is helping students at all levels have access to great teachers, have access to quality academic resources, have access to people who believe in them, and have access to quality experiences. And so our work spans over 200 cities across the country, and we really support our partners in doing 3 things. We help them diagnose what's happening, uncover the issues. We help them design solutions. And finally, we help them execute a plan. And our work has been very wide-reaching. We've supplied over thousands of teachers in our 20 years to the workforce through our fellows programs. We've helped districts and school systems redesign their academic strategies. We have been on the forefront of a lot of the talent policy that you see as it relates to teacher retention, recruitment, compensation. And so, you know, in a couple of minutes, I can't sum up all of our work, but I will say we as an organization, we have been a leader in the field, and we have used this 20+ year trajectory to really not only be a leading voice, but also be a convening voice. Our work has expanded to focus on community engagement and developing community coalitions. Our work also includes a lot of resources related to helping our district partners and our school partners really think about their DEI journeys in ways that we have also done internally. So that's who we are. The other thing I like to share is we're a virtual organization. And so when you think about the breadth and depth of the work we're able to do, we have about 400 people all across this country who are not only working with our partners, but working in their communities to bring our mission, which is to end educational inequity, to life. Leticia, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think you gave a great overview of what we do. I think the only thing I want to underscore, Kimberly, from your point about calling out the 3 organizations, like we intentionally took this risk. To Tamika's point, we are very fortunate to be seen as leaders in the industry, and that means we also have a responsibility to show the messy side of work, to encourage others to take those steps too. And that's why we feel good about joining in this work with Promise54, because we know if we aren't willing to take that risk and show that moving into and leaning into the real work of DEI, and how it's not linear, how it's not a button-up task list of things that you do and then you're done and everyone feels great. Like if we aren't willing to be on the forefront of that, then we're missing an opportunity to change how the sector addresses those issues. And we want to make sure that we are being vulnerable in that space, because we know we only grow from that if we do. So I think Tamika gave a great overview here. I just wanted to make sure we also connected to why we felt it was important to be a part of this too.
Thank you so much for that key point, Leticia. Thank you, thank you. So now that you both have gotten the opportunity to kind of share a little bit about TNTP as a headline, we'd love to give you all on this line a snapshot of where the story, TNTP's story starts in the case. Of course, there's lots and lots of ways to tell a story, again, but this is the real inflection point that we dug into. When we started our research and really started to tell TNTP stories. So we wanted to give you just a picture of it, and we'll take 2 minutes to dive right into the messy. I'll say no more. But maybe I should, no, I'll say no more. Go for it.
TNTP had made a commitment to support Puerto Rico in any way that we could. The Puerto Rico Department of Ed, really with as much sort of, by even providing staff capacity in a pro bono way to Puerto Rico. Initially, that conversation had involved the Latinx staff at TNTP around what were the best ways we could provide that support and what that support would look like. The months that followed, there wasn't really a lot of information on what our decision was, how we were going to support the island.
The decision was made by our CEO, Dan, to decide that we were going to move forward with Puerto Rico without consulting our Latinx affinity group, or going back to our Latinx affinity group.
We also found out that the staff member that was being provided to support Puerto Rico wasn't a member of the Latinx community at TNTP. And sort of that was the second thing that sort of really negatively impacted us as a community. One, that we weren't able to be involved in the decision-making process. And two, that when we were deciding what were the qualities of an individual, or what were the experiences or background or information context relevant in supporting Puerto Rico, we didn't think the Latinx voice was one of them. The rest of the Latinx staff was mad. They were disappointed, they were hurt, they were feeling the same things I was feeling. It was just another example of how the voices of the communities that we are supposed to be serving are not involved in the conversation.
I was really devastated. I mean, I knew immediately that I had made a big mistake, that I had kind of blundered ahead after committing to a group of people who cared very much about this issue, that I would work with them, and just kind of blundered ahead and did things on my own in a way that was really exclusive and hurt a lot of people's feelings.
Once that was
Of course, there's more to the story, but we wanted to give you just a snapshot. Imagining that in a senior leadership team meeting of 100+ partners at the organization, someone pointed out this real gap between intention and impact, between expediency and Leticia, actually on this call, you pointed out that there was this gap between expediency and decision making, and really honoring perspective and community in order to better serve community. And we're just, we wanted to capture that inflection point and the heat of it And I'll also share with you that this was just one spark in TNTP story. There were many other themes that came up as we continued the research here. Ms. Rita, do you want to share some of that?
So there were several key themes that emerged as we dove into, what does this work look like throughout TNTP's journey. And so first, TNTP began by focusing on diversifying its leadership and staff. They focused on recruitment and retention efforts. They set diversity goals and began making progress and continue to see progress toward them. But once staff and leadership, increased its diversity, it wasn't enough just to have more voices or different voices in the rooms. It's been really critical not just to have them there, but also to make space for staff to air and share concerns, and also for leadership to respond to them, to listen and respond. And the Puerto Rico incident was one of the first times that staff felt they actually saw and felt a response from leadership, that it wasn't just, hey, like we see something that doesn't feel right. There was actually follow-up on, okay, let's talk about this and what does this mean? And then TNTP has taken the critical step of codifying their DEI beliefs and definitions, and developing a strategic plan around their DEI work. So there was a lot of deep value and power in creating a shared vision for what TNTP means when they say DEI, when they say diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what they want that to look like and feel like at TNTP. And this shared language has allowed an open opportunity for TNTP to expand the conversations and expand awareness around DEI issues. They now have a shared language around which to cohere and say, hey, this is what we're noticing, and we know what we mean when we say these words. And that's facilitated not just the conversations, but they're now working to develop a culture of interruptions in a context where folks are not just set up to talk about DEI, but to then take action and ask, so what does this mean? We now are able to name the thing. So how do we move forward? How do we interrupt the thing? And one of the areas in which they are really working to think about what does it mean to interrupt in places where we're experiencing barriers to inclusion has been around white dominant culture norms. They acknowledge that they're ever present in a lot of the ways in which they operate, and also acknowledge that there are ways in which these norms are providing barriers to their progress on DEI and a more inclusive culture. So they're working to tackle what it means to confront and acknowledge those. And we'll show a short clip as to where we left off in terms of where the case study, what we heard last from them when we were wrapping up our research, before we turn it back to Tamika and Leticia to let us know what's happened since.
To show that.
So I think leadership has recognized the role that they play, and that.
Sorry.
To show that.
So I think leadership has recognized the role that they play, and that they're willing to try to make that change necessary. Does that mean they know exactly what they have to do? No. But I think it means that they, as well as ourselves, have to show each other some grace in navigating the conversation, because at the end of the day, we're all nobody has the answer.
As CEO, there's no roadmap for me. I'm being pushed every day in really healthy ways and really interesting ways. There's not a book I can take off a shelf that's going to tell me exactly how to lead a difficult conversation about race or structural racism, or how to be transparent in every instance. These are things that I've got to be vulnerable. I've got to take some risks as a leader, and depend upon the goodwill which abounds all around me to help me get better as a leader and to learn.
There's no easy way to do it. You're gonna feel like you're failing, and you're gonna fail. You're gonna feel like you're not gonna have the answers, and that's because you're not gonna have the answers. but that you have to do it. Because at the end of the day, if you work through the discomfort, if you work through the not knowing, you end up with something that is more responsive and more adequate to support those communities that we're trying to support.
That is what gives me hope, is that I get to see people who are changing. I get to see people who are becoming more aware, and I get to see and experience people who are using knowledge as a way to become action oriented, and that they see how much work needs to be done on themselves. Because ultimately, in order to change the world, you have to start with yourself first. And so that is what I get to participate in, and I'm just grateful for those opportunities.
We're probably going to face even more difficult challenges going forward, but I'm confident that we can meet those challenges because what we have is all the hearts and the minds across the organization that are really leaning into being courageous and working to make sure we're a better organization.
So since the case study, TNTP has continued its DEI work, and we'd love to hear more from Tamika and Leticia around what's happened since.
So you heard Lucerito talk about the way we've codified, our work and our journey. And so TNTP, one thing I think is important to say, there were some conditions in place that helped us before, this incident, before this inflection point, rather, that helped us kind of pave the way. We are fortunate to have a CEO and a leadership team who have always believed that our people are our biggest asset as an organization. And so to that end, when we had this major inflection point, it was another opportunity for us to model what we do in the field. So we developed we call it our accelerating DEI strategy. And that strategy really had 3 focal points. The DEI structures that kind of undergird and ground our experiences. A second piece to really look at our talent practices. And a third piece to look at what's the overarching experience that we want all staff in the organization to have. And so through the lens of that strategy, we were able to redesign our performance management system, right? We were able to make a sharp change to the way staff were promoted. We were able to define a set of manager, not competencies, but manager commitments that we expect all managers across the organization to adhere to. And we redesigned our core values. And that's huge because I'll say, as a person in the org, we had a pretty good set of core values, right? Like, they weren't something that didn't feel lived, and we said, what do our core values need to be in light of this new reality? The other piece in the staff experience, in stating it, how do we grow and develop our staff? What's our belief around that explicitly? And the really exciting part about some of those structures we've been able to implement is that it wasn't, while the leadership was definitely involved, this was a full org experience. We had our affinity groups who were able to play a leading role. We had a variety of working groups across the organization to come together to produce these deliverables. We also created a DEI dashboard so that there's a level of transparency about basic things like, what's our representation? How are we aligning? What are our representation and other DEI organizational goals? And I'm really excited because we also did this in our strategic planning process. And so our strategic plan, our DEI strategy, all align and cascade. We also, there's so much, and I know, we were asked to just share a few things, but I think it's important to show that there were multiple things that have occurred since the case study, because DEI, you heard Leticia say, this isn't a linear journey. it's a comprehensive, all-in approach. So we couldn't just look at, core values and not look at the corresponding performance management, or not look at how we promote people. We couldn't just ask affinity groups and staff members, particularly staff of color, to shoulder the burden of raising their voice and raising issues without really taking a step back to look at, are we empowering them to do this, not just as it relates to DEI. And one thing I'm super excited about, which is a testament about the power of community and the power of people being the kind of definers of our journey, is our Latinx recruitment and retention strategy that was also an outcome. And I'll turn it over to Leticia to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. So that's actually, to Tamika's point, we wanted to make sure that we weren't just addressing an in-the-moment situation. Puerto Rico was not the end-all be-all of TNTP's engagement with Latinx staff. It was, a manifestation of not having truly thought about how are we engaging our staff along the full spectrum of our work. So to address that bigger issue, we wanted to make sure that we were taking some deep dives into where do we need to be really reflective and make some key lines in the sand of we know we are not growing in the space, so we are going to push ourselves to grow. And one of them is in our Latino staff representation. We've consistently held very low for a national organization, and we have never understood why. So we decided to make that a goal. If we can't just say it is what it is. If we know we are serving public schools and charter schools across the country, we know we need to engage in staff who mirror our mission and values, which is to serve all students. And a majority of students are Latino and a majority of students are African American. And we need to make sure we're looking at, does our staff represent that as well? So we were making an intentional line in the sand to say, we know we need to grow, and here is a plan to do it. We developed this plan both based off feedback from our Latinx affinity group, who was directly involved with issues around representation to address the Puerto Rico issue, but in having those conversations lifted up what it felt like to work here, what felt good, what felt polarizing, what felt isolating, but what felt welcoming, so that we could create an environment where we're honoring the folks who are here, because we've got amazingly committed staff across all areas of representation, including our Latino staff. So what is it about what keeps them here that we can draw from, and what is it that we need to examine so that we can create a more welcoming environment for others who have their same skill sets and their same talents, so we can create more opportunities for our Latino staff representation to grow. And we wanted to make sure we were building in not just the Latino perspective, but also the ownership and onus from others to carry that burden with us, and not to see it as a burden, but to see it as an opportunity. I see it as like, this is how we will be responsive to the needs of our districts that we serve. And when we started talking about it to groups, including Tamika and with folks on our workforce and talent, there was a lot of excitement of saying, yeah, I know I don't know this, and I want to know how to address it. So we've been building that out, and we have a 5-year goal to go from, we've traditionally been at 6 to 8% representation. We're pushing to be at 30% Latino representation. That's a very bold statement. I don't think I've seen that from any other education nonprofit, to say, we know this is a growth area for us, and this is what we're committing to internally and externally. Hold us accountable, be here with us to go on this journey with us. And it meant a lot. It meant a lot to see that stated so clearly and succinctly from leadership, because it interpreted to staff who are Latino, like they did hear us. It's not just a pat on the head, I'm sorry that happened, we'll try and be better, but a tangible way to address not just one issue, but a systemic issue of representation. And be excited about what that could mean, because it's not about wallowing in what doesn't work, but in providing the hope and opportunity and enthusiasm to make the change that's going to make us stronger. And as I've had the conversations on our recruitment and retention proposal, it's all been good, especially from the folks who have felt this most felt the sting more abruptly as Latino staff. Like, this is not something where they're saying, sure, finally they're going to do it. This is something where they're saying, this is exciting. This feels like people are really invested in us growing here. And it's a palpable energy that makes you really want to push and do this, like dig deeper and pushes our group, our being Latinos, to think about how does this impact other marginalized groups? What could we share so that other groups who may be feeling like, I don't feel seen here, like we aren't replicating that same experience, but we're actually replicating how to address solutions to make a more inclusive table for us. So I'm really excited about that.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for sharing some of your reflections and those updates. We want to shift now to Q&A. So I want to invite, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I want to invite participants to chat in questions, and then we can read them out to Tamika and Leticia for them to respond. But to kick us off, we'd love to hear from each of you, if there was, did you find anything surprising in participating, like in this process, and in seeing, you know, your journey codified and represented in this way? Was there anything surprising or anything, any reflections or learnings that you had from this case study process for yourselves, or that you saw organizationally?
I think not so much surprising, but we are a virtual organization. And in some ways, as a virtual organization, not in some ways, in many ways, there's an even greater intentionality that's needed to create an inclusive culture. There's an intentionality that's needed to ensure equitable experiences. And so as we started opening up a lot of these conversations, it wasn't just centralized in one team or, you know, one region or one scope of work. There was a pervasiveness to some of the challenges, and perversely, that was a unifying piece. And you heard Leticia say this, like, even with our Latinx strategy, you know, on the outside, you could say, well, Tamika, you're not a Latinx staff member. Why does this matter to you? It matters because the commonality, the intersectionality, and we are, you know, we're building solidarity across our staff members to be able to say, it's not good enough to, you know, have any person in our organization feel this way. And so the surprise was how pervasive some of the experiences were. And then the flip side of that, the way staff of all different, like, historically marginalized backgrounds really were able to come together and say, like, all means all, we're all in this together. And that has been, you know, that's one of the things that keeps me here at TNTP.
I think for me, one of the things that stood out, and Tamika hinted at this a little bit before, but this inflection point happened because of a series of other things that we did. I can't say that had we not taken those other steps, I would have felt comfortable calling this out, to be honest. And even when I took the risk to call it out, it wasn't just to call it out. I was validated by Tamika and a few others who stood with me in the room and said, this is an issue. This is something, this is not the only example we can point to. And not every organization is going to have this catalyst inflection moment, but every organization has an opportunity to validate when someone brings up something that isn't sitting right with them. And I think that is so important for creating inclusive spaces. You may not have to experience yourself, but you can see when something isn't sitting right with someone, and you can validate that what they're feeling has merit. And I think that creates more safe spaces and more opportunity to grow when folks know every single time they call something out, it is not them against the org or them against their team. It is them bringing up something that may make their organization stronger.
I saw in the chat there was a question about how do we define inclusion. So I just chatted our definition of inclusion. So through a series of working groups and staff input, we define inclusion this way. And it was important for us, you know, every organization is different. And for each of our DEI definitions, we have a corresponding, we have the definition and a corresponding belief. And our belief around inclusion is that all staff members have the opportunity to, we value people and their unique background and their contributions, and we take this collective responsibility so that people feel supported and cared about. We're not trying to replicate, you know, there's not one model of a TNTPer. When you come to TNTP, you don't leave the experiences you had prior to TNTP at the door. Those are the actual things that make our work better. You know, so how do we create space for people to feel like they can bring their authentic selves to work? And that's a little different than whole self, right? Like, how can they feel authentic and engaged and feel like every part of them is valued? We have affinity groups because we don't want people to feel, we have a variety of affinity groups because we don't want people to start to feel like, oh, I gotta pick and choose which one of my identities I wanna show up as today. So our definition of inclusion is really what it looks like to put diversity in action. And we measure that through our staff engagement data. We use Culture Amp, and in this last iteration of our engagement survey, we actually modified to include more questions specifically around like this inclusion factor.
Yeah, and I love what you're naming here, Tamika, on the inclusion front around, Craig, I think underneath your question are these two things. There's one, which is like the philosophical, how do we name what inclusion means for us as an organization? And then I see the tension in your question also about what you're working on is like increasing the perception that the organization is inclusive or that the team is inclusive. And I think to Tamika's earlier point, she talked about all of these things that needed to be put into place that are aligned to the definition. So the definition of us valuing all the folks on the team is only put into action through reconceptualization of how managers are relating to their teams and valuing the voices and perspectives of folks in meetings, shifting the way that meetings are structured and led such that it is not just the hierarchy that gets the first and loudest voice, but folks across the team are able to offer input, and that input is actually taken, received, and valued. And so I want to double click, Tamika, on this point that you said about putting it into action, because there's this space between we're defining inclusion, but have we actually really interrogated all of our behaviors and structures so that they're aligned with that definition of inclusion? And we often say that we spend the most time in the inclusion bucket when we're doing organizational change work, because if you are the leader of the initiative, you likely are really, really close to the intention, like the technical things that have been put into place to try to realize inclusion. But if you're on the receiving end, if you are not necessarily leading the initiative, you're waiting to feel differently about the team. And that takes a long time. So Craig, I'm interpreting your question as like, I'm leading the initiative and I'm trying to impact the perception by putting some different things into action. And the folks over there who may not be as proximate to the leadership of the initiative aren't feeling the difference yet. And that's fine. It takes some time. And we often describe the fact that because it's nonlinear, it sometimes can get worse before it gets better, but continue to listen to the feedback that you're getting about perception. I think that's something that TNTP has been, that you both, Tamika and Leticia, are talking about. You've been listening and listening and listening and iterating systems and processes in order to get stronger there.
Thanks all. So folks, please feel free, as mentioned, to chat in questions. If you're unable to chat, you can try to unmute yourself and speak your question. But another question that we have for you, Tamika and Leticia, we're wondering, as women of color in this organization and involved in your involvement in this DEI work, how have you personally experienced or navigated what is often felt to be and experienced as a disproportionate burden on people of color within the context of DEI work, right? Whether it's to make the call out, to sort of put yourself out on a limb, to interrupt something or to name something, or just, you know, to be on the receiving end of initiatives and or microaggressions, or, you know, some of these cultural norms that you all have addressed. So just wondering what your personal experiences have been, given your identities navigating this work.
When I came in 6 years ago, I could count on my hands the number of women of color and the number of Black women. And in terms of like in leadership roles, I couldn't use both hands. So it was, you know, it wasn't new to me being in majority white spaces. So I think there is a resilience that you naturally sometimes have when you're used to that. So I think all of that to say, as more women of color came, I felt it was like, I felt seen, even if the you know, we identified in different ways, there was a level of like connection, familiarity, to be able to have other people to share experiences with. Earlier in my TNTP experience, not only was I coming in as an African-American woman to a predominantly, you know, a new team and a predominantly white team, I also was coming in as a person who didn't have the traditional ed reformer background. And so that kind of created space to raise issues, say things that, you know, opened the way for me to be able to advocate for things, particularly as a woman of color. And I'll say, like, when I think about Tamika and TNTP in year one versus Tamika and TNTP now, there's a level of comfort. And, you know, I've also been educated. Quite honestly, you know, with our that we've done for staff, there's a language that I have now that I didn't have to name some of the things I felt or experienced. There's both a necessary space and a safe space to be able to raise those things. And so I would say it has been, for me, it's been an upward trajectory of feeling like, wow, it's only too few of us, to, you know, there are more of us, we are supporting each other. And I've been able to, you know, I've been fortunate to have a great management experience at each of my stages at TNTP. So I would say that shielded me in some ways from some experiences that maybe others weren't privy to.
Yeah, I think I've been with TNTP for 4 years, and prior to that, most of my work trajectory had been in Latino-led organizations. So it was a new experience for me to be in a white dominant organization. It wasn't my only experience in white dominant, but it was one where it was very clear that there was unspoken ways to do things. And if I didn't figure it out, a narrative could be painted about me. On the flip side, I also didn't know it in terms of like how to navigate it. So I blundered into spaces because, like, well, don't we just call things out when we see it? Because that was where I came from, which gave me ironically, some leverage, because that's how people started, well, she's gonna call it out, because I didn't know I shouldn't call it out. I didn't know that wasn't the norm. I assumed, like, that's how I came from, spaces where you did kind of do that, and it, you know, you did that and that's how things were. But I'm also very aware that the level at which I came into TNTP allowed me that space too. So I came in as a partner because the CEO that you saw in the video, he's made a commitment to bringing people with different perspectives. That also meant that I didn't have the polish of the ed reform, but I did have other polish that I brought to it. And I became aware that folks who hadn't called things out, it wasn't because they didn't see it in the same way. I'm thinking of like my colleagues of color. It was because that, you want to grow, you want to get to that leadership level. And if you rock the boat too soon, you get a narrative painted about you. I happened to be able to rock the boat as I was navigating it. I don't know that I could have done it if I came in as an analyst or a site manager, because I wouldn't have that luxury. I'm very aware of the luxury that I have in title. So I am aware of the structures. I am able to understand the structures that I benefit from too. And I think as we've grown into this space of what does this mean for staff experience, it's what I bring to the table, knowing that not everyone's going to have the luxury that I do of calling things out, but also being able to have a conversation with the CEO because we are in working groups together. We work more closely together. Like, what does that mean for folks who won't have that experience? And how can I leverage that voice so that it doesn't feel so different for one person versus me, so that my experience isn't unique and we are creating spaces where all folks can call to the table what doesn't feel right. And I think that's probably the biggest responsibility I hold in my role, is like who is not able to speak in the same way that I am, and what are we doing to rectify that, because that isn't fair. And that should be how we look at an equitable staff experience, that everyone can come to the table in the same way that I do.
Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing some great gems there. So in our last few minutes, we'll take one more question and then wrap. And we have a question from Kim, who is curious about this idea or concept of giving and having grace on this DEI journey. And she's curious as to how this was talked about and presented to staff as you are in your DEI journey.
I would say quickly, we have some silence breakers, like basic little structures, like silence breakers to help as entry points in some of these conversations. We had a set of agreements that kind of focused on experiencing discomfort. We also had some assumptions, like all of our staff in our organization have the opportunity to attend a learning experience called Conscious Inclusion. And there we start to examine our identities, our biases, conscious and unconscious. So there was a foundational language that many of our staff members had, and we leaned into it. And I would say, Leticia, feel free to also agree or disagree, but I think the concept of grace is evolving. There are times when it's easier to be gracious, and there are times when it's harder. And so I don't know that we've mastered it, but we rely really heavily on our structures and on our networks to be able to help us be more gracious with each other.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we are so incredibly grateful for Leticia and Tamika, for the two of you to take the time to share more about TNTP's journey, about your own experiences at TNTP. And we're really grateful for all the folks who have joined us today. And to close us out, would just like to provide some additional opportunities to remain engaged in conversation with us and or this work. And we encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to check out our case studies at casestudies.promise54.org, where we have additional multimedia. You can dive deeper into the journeys of not only TNTP's DEI work, but also College Track and Blue Engine, and you'll see various themes and some overlapping themes emerge, which we hope resonate across a variety of organizations and experiences. We will also be having additional webinars to speak with the other participating organizations. We've got a webinar with College Track on March 24th, and then one with Blue Engine on April 23rd. So we'd love to have you join us for those as well, to speak to leadership from those organizations and dive deeper into what their experiences have been like in this work. We also want to encourage you to consider participating in some of our cohort experiences. As mentioned, it's something that we offer. We've got our Talent Equity Consortium coming up for DC and Denver cohorts. So we encourage you to reach out if you're interested in participating there. And also learn more about Promise54, visit our website and learn more about TNTP, tntp.org, promise54.org. Please feel free to be in touch if you have additional questions, if there are opportunities for collaboration. We'd love to continue this conversation, and we're so grateful for your engagement thus far, and would like to keep the lines of communication open. This work, as we all know, is ongoing. It never ends, and we love to know that there are so many wonderful people engaged in really hard issues in education and beyond. So thank you all so much for your time. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a great weekend, and stay in touch.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much, Tamika and Leticia. Such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.